We've got Barrow Hamilton, who is VP of Product from All Clear ID, and All Clear ID focuses on breach response and ID protection. And we also have Dr. Heather Hinton with us from IBM. She is a CISO for the hybrid cloud, and she's a distinguished engineer as well. So, the topic of the day, should identity professionals own security? Real quick, binary response, Barrow, yes or no?
No.
Heidi, yes or no?
No.
Okay.
No.
Thank you so much for your time. No, this is great. The world's fastest panel. So let's open it up just a little bit, just to make sure that everybody really deserves their lunch. When it comes to identity, when it comes to security, these are broad topics. So let's start with you, Heather. When we're talking about identity and how the security professional should interact with it, are you talking, when you hear that, are you referencing it more from the standpoint of, is this identity for a customer or is this identity for an employee?
So when I first heard you say that, I immediately went to identity of the employee, because at IBM that's one of the things I'm concerned about. And in my mind, the answer there was categorically the identity proof process actually is owned by HR. So they're not even identity professionals. And then the IAM crew have to work with whatever we get from HR to make sure that we can then make that work in the security world for access control and authorization and the appropriate logging and whatnot. And I'm going to bring in GDPR really early and set up Heidi. Having spent the last forever, it seems like, getting ready for GDPR, what was sort of interesting for me was that all of that information that we maintain about individuals, be they employees or be they our clients or our clients' users for our cloud and SaaS offerings, that information has morphed and is now information that I consider to be the same level of sensitivity, of confidentiality in how I have to handle it as my clients' their financial data or whatever their very sensitive data is. Identity information has become a first-class resource that I have to protect the same way and secure the same way I have to protect other data. So, and I think that that's the case whether I'm talking about employees, whether I'm talking about clients, or whether I'm talking about all of the information that is known about me in the social context. And on that point, I'm going to pass it over to Heidi because that's natural for her.
Sure. So my perspective when I was posed the question for the panel, I think this is a reflection of us sort of having coming at it from very different angles, is that in my experience, I thought of it similar to how privacy and security have always been sort of two sides of the same coin, is a nice way of saying it. When I was a CPO, I had a very good relationship with my CISO, but we definitely butted heads on approach to collection and use of different types of data. And to Heather's point, I think the sort of new model that we're in now, and GDPR has certainly pushed it along, but I don't think the struggle or the approach or the disagreement is necessarily new or wouldn't have come to a head without GDPR anyway. It might just have taken a little bit longer. Now we look at things as an entire record. So as before you might have talked about employee data or consumer data, now thanks to things like data subject access requests under the GDPR, we have to think about when somebody's making a request and they want to see the file that you have on them or the record that you have on them, what is the universe of information that they have the right to review, and how do identity professionals think about making that available, keeping that aggregated, and how do privacy and security work together to determine what the limits of what the limits are of the data that's included in that record or in that file that's made available.
And my background is much more around data breach response and thinking about it from a end user customer perspective of the clients we work with. And so, I think security is a much broader topic than just identity, which is why I gave my answer I did. But I think they need to be very closely aligned, and I think identity needs to be a critical piece of all the security planning that any enterprise does. You mentioned identity becoming a first-class citizen. You know, in my mind, it should be like the utmost first-class citizen, because not only is it valuable information that enterprises have that they make use of as part of their business process, but the misuse of that not only can have some immediate financial consequences, but some very long-term consequences in terms of the brand of an enterprise, customer defection. It's very hard to get that loyalty back once you've broken that trust.
Excellent. So we had a great presentation this morning from Andrew McAfee about thinking about how to run businesses differently this morning. And so picking up where you left off, Heidi, with regard to working security and privacy kind of simultaneously together, these things interact with identity in a precarious way sometimes. Just out of curiosity, who here in the crowd would hold themselves out to be an identity professional first and foremost? Okay, what about security professional first and foremost? Okay, so should we just make all the security professionals employees of the identity professionals and let identity kind of be the dictate of how the security should run, or is there potentially a better model to organize how these things are thought about?
I'm sure there are plenty of identity professionals who wouldn't mind being in charge of all the security professionals, at least for one day. I'm sure there are plenty of privacy professionals who also would not mind being in charge of the security professionals, at least for one day. The model of, at least again, to sort of align, I think privacy and identity have a lot of common core values and common core principles when you're thinking about how to execute identity management, how to execute access governance. So before there was a GDPR, privacy and identity, we're talking about things like data minimization, least privilege access. These are topics that had already been discussed and terms that had already been used quite frequently. And I think that it's hard to legislate ethical values and ethics, but I think that stems from a lot of ethical values. So thinking about, for example, in the healthcare profession, just because somebody can see a record, should they be able to see a record? And that is a very close alignment in making those decisions between privacy and identity. So thinking about roles, thinking about rules, and playing those two together. Security has always been the execution of what a lot of privacy and identity sometimes will come to terms with or will decide. And so to have one be the overall of the other creates a situation where you might have somebody overriding decisions of the others and being able to say, well, I mean, in my experience, when it was, well, why do we need social security numbers? Why are you worried about us collecting social security numbers? I can just lock them all down. I mean, that was a conversation that I had over and over again. There's no law that says you can't collect social security numbers. There's no law that says you can't use them as the identifier throughout the systems. Why can't we just use that? I'll just make sure it's secure. I mean, I had that conversation over and over again with the security side. And so I actually think that it's more of a Venn diagram, because we love Venn diagrams. It's about all those stakeholders coming together and having conversations and making collaborative decisions, which I understand is much easier said than done.
I actually believe that there is no law against using a social security number. It's actually a very US-centric point of view. It is absolutely legislated that you can't use those pieces as identifiers.
Absolutely. It was an example from my past.
No,
a very US-based example.
But I think that what GDPR, which I love the spirit, I'm not really thrilled with the execution, right? It is a very powerful bill, but it's a powerful bill that has some very kind of crazy implementation aspects in it. But what GDPR is going to, I think, force us to do is, in the context of identity, is sort of normalize how it is that we choose to identify an individual, because it is no longer just my email or my social security number, that the notion of identity being an aggregate of pieces of information that might not, any of them individually, point to me, because none of them individually says Heather Hinton, but when I put together all of this other information, now it's very clear that it's Heather or Heidi or Barrow, and it's one of those three, and it can only be one of those three. I think that in that context, now what identity professionals have to do is widen their scope of how they are going to be treating the identity, which is why I go back to the identity family. It's no longer just a single unique identifier that is referring to a user. And now I have to, I think, change how I think about protecting those. So back to the identity family is a tier 1 set of data that I have to be concerned. I've got to broaden my scope of what can happen to that data. Yeah. And from a breach point of view, my hair is on fire.
Yeah, I think you have to think even more so about, what the thing I like about GDPR, I feel like it acknowledges and recognizes that we as individuals have a right to have protections about our identity, that our identity is ours. But if you think about our interactions with an enterprise, that becomes blurred pretty quickly, right? So I may show up and say, here's Barrow, I want to use your services, but very quickly I'm sharing data with you that becomes part of your business process, that may become intellectual property, that may become part of how you go about doing business. So you have to think about it that way. As at the back end of this, as an identity professional, is what are the things that we need to do, and think about it. I think it's a useful context to think about it like a security professional. What do we have to do planning-wise, protection-wise, technology-wise to protect that individual's identity, but on the flip side of that, still enable our processes to take place as an enterprise that make use of that information.
So everybody here keeps mentioning GDPR, so we can talk about GDPR if you really want to.
I'm really tired of talking about GDPR. It keeps coming back like bad laundry.
Maybe, but I think people want to hear about it. So
They look like they want to hear about it.
They do. I mean, everybody's hands up. So one of the things that I think at least Heather and potentially all three of you had mentioned is this idea of securing the data, and the idea of this data, this identity data, being the property now, in theory, not necessarily of the enterprise, but to some degree owned by an individual. To what degree should we start thinking as identity professionals and security professionals about the kind of dual layer of security with regard to, let me clarify where I'm coming from for a second. The typical model is we've got this data that's protected against some sort of outside bad actor who wants access to it. But we live now in a world where somebody who's covered by GDPR could say, no, but I want access to my information. I want to understand how potentially some decisions got made. So how do we start thinking about the security design there in order to protect enterprise value that comes from that identity data? A specific example here would be, let's say that for some reason Watson was doing some sort of analysis to determine, maybe not Watson, I don't want to be product specific, Splotzen is doing some sort of ML level algorithm to determine that I've got cancer, I've got a tumor, but my tumor's benign. And I'm assured now that my tumor is benign, and I, as somebody who has now given my healthcare data to the system, want to know, cool, how does it know this? I want to know how it came to that decision that I don't have to have surgery. So how do we start thinking as an industry about kind of these layers of security, about the bands of data that we would want to make publicly or pseudo-publicly available to specific individuals?
You went for like the hottest of the hot potatoes that you could. So part of me says I'm obliged to say that legal has to get involved in that conversation, because part of what you are asking is, does GDPR provide individuals with the ability to do things like infer, or in a previous life we would have called industrial espionage, intellectual property, right, on how I'm doing things, for example, like cancer. There are a couple of things that you can do to fix that, right? You can anonymize so that when you go through the analysis on, does Josh really have a brain tumor, or is he having a bad day, when that assessment is being done, it's not known that this is Josh that this assessment is being done for. So you've used pseudonymization, obfuscation, minimization, whatever your kind of preferred approach is. You do your analysis and then you get your result back so that you keep your intellectual property there. I think that this is a very interesting future area, and it's one that GDPR has sort of touched on, because they do talk about aggregation. What do you learn, or consultation? What can you do by putting all of this information together? What else can you infer? I think that that's one of those areas where it's not necessarily really well thought out, because it was really focused on marketing, right? What is it that, if I see that you've looked at these 3 posts on Facebook, what am I going to market for you? Am I going to send you that target ad for baby equipment that goes to your parents and they discover that you are 16 and pregnant because of what came from those ads? That's a different scenario. That's like a creepy scenario that I'm okay having legislated. Versus the business scenarios, and I think this is where we've got these overlaps that we haven't figured out, and I think actually we don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting area because it's such a fine line between you have my information, you've done something valuable for me, but you've done something with that's intellectually your own property and methodology and how you go about doing something, which enables you to provide value to other people as well. I mean, the other side of this as well is this concept of, keep the data for as long as you need it for whatever process you need, whatever value you're providing, and then get rid of the data. So you were talking about, anonymizing data. So in the case of the medical evaluation, perhaps you go through a process, you draw a conclusion, you provide that conclusion to the individual. If you no longer have a business purpose for that individual's data, then it's possible to delete that data, and then they've gotten the information they need. Now, if they come back to you and say, hey, I want to know how you concluded that about me, perhaps there's some general principles that you can tell them about that sort of help them understand that. But at the end of the day, if what they're wanting to know is, hey, do you not have my personal data anymore? If you've deleted it because you've served the purpose, then obviously you've cared for that as well.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. Part of this discussion is kind of like modern art. I know, I know it when I see it, or I like it when I see it.
Are you confusing modern art with pornography?
Yeah. I went to MoMA, okay? I went to MoMA. There's some stuff. But there's also this completely unknown creepy factor, right? It's creepy that you can figure out that someone's daughter is pregnant, and maybe it's creepy, but I'm okay with creepy in figuring out if I've got a tumor or not too. So the big unknown here is when we're dealing with all of this, what's the creepy litmus test that we're providing to how we deal with all of this data?
Sounds like there could be a business opportunity for anybody who wants to design the creepy litmus test.
I'm sure there's a patent on it somewhere.
Probably so. Okay, so we've got 8 minutes left. I've got 2 questions left. The first is probably slightly more practical than the second, but obviously if you guys have spent some time here with us today, we want to make sure that we can leave you with something that is at least practical when you walk away. So can anybody, can you guys deliver kind of at a high line what your best practice takeaway would be for an identity professional to kind of best practices, the thing they could do to make their identities more secure, or how they could think about working with the security professional in the best way to get some sort of material value out of that relationship?
Why are you looking at me first?
I can go.
I'll start. I would say, or at least assume a breach is going to happen. Plan for it. Assume it's going to happen. Just like all the other things you plan for in your business, across your company, there's all kinds of scenarios that businesses plan for. This should be one of the things you should plan for, and you should then manage your identities and think about the application of process and technology in that light.
I'll second that. I'd go just sort of even like one step higher and a little bit broader. So in the overlapping worlds that Barrow and I live in, we talk until we are blue in the face about having an incident response plan, testing your incident response plan, and being prepared, because trust me, there is nothing worse than having the oh shit moment and nothing to grasp at and nothing to look at and no guidance and being totally lost and flailing around. And as part of the developing an IR plan, we often talk about companies identifying their crown jewels. Mm-hmm. And to what Heather's earlier point was, I think the definition or what we prioritize as our crown jewels has shifted a lot over the past 10 years. So 10 years ago, it really was very—
financial data.
It was financial data, or in the world that I lived in, it was social security numbers, it was employee data, it was payroll information. Now there was an interim shift where it turned much more into intellectual property, not forgetting those things, but a lot of those systems became more mature that stored that type of data, and so there was a lot less concern around them, and it became, what about all this sort of contract data and research data and things like that, algorithms, all that kind of stuff. And now I think we're entering sort of a third phase, and we're broadening it again to talk about things like, what is identity data, what gets stored, what gets collected, how do those decisions get made, how did the decisions get made about whether Josh has a tumor or is having a bad day. So I think all of that is to say that the practical step is to go back and have a conversation about what your company or organization defines as its crown jewels, and maybe start saying, but I think identity is a piece of this. And how do we factor that into our overall risk profile? How do we factor that into our overall incident response plan? We need to be thinking about that and integrating it at a much higher level.
Yeah. So, and I as the hardcore security person, I cannot emphasize how important it is to have some sort of incident response plan. And it can be as simple as pick up the phone and call the CISO or something, but you have to have a plan for dealing with this, because if you don't, you're going to waste a lot of valuable time trying to figure it out. So echoing Barrow and Heidi, I think the single thing that I would encourage identity professionals to do is to really, if you haven't already, get a comprehensive data map of all of the identity-related data that you maintain within your company, about your employees, about your clients, about their users, and it's everything. You need to understand everything that you've got in there. And there are a couple of reasons to do this. This will help you understand what you need to do if there's an incident, because you will have been able to go through and say, this is really important, this is less important. It will help you, it will allow you to have a sane conversation with the security professionals on, this data is really important, I need this data to be encrypted, this data, I would like it to be encrypted, but it doesn't have to be encrypted. This data must be anonymized. You can now have a fact-based conversation with your security professionals on how they need to be securing that data for you, so that you can come in and you can have a conversation. So earlier, when we were sort of prepping, we sort of talked about almost like a Venn diagram. If you think about it as a chief privacy officer and then a CISO, in many organizations, they're becoming very much peer-like. We batted around the idea of a chief identity officer, and I think that maybe we'll get there, but we're not there right now. But the chief identity officer, or the head of identity, really becomes the glue in having the same conversations between your chief privacy officer and your CISO, because they're the ones that can speak both languages. Here's what I need to do to protect this data from a privacy point of view. Here's what I need to do to protect it from a security point of view. So the identity professional's role is going to become far more influential than I think it has been in the past.
Awesome, thank you. It's always nice to be able to walk away with a framework, so I appreciate that. Okay, so for the far less practical way to leave you guys, so this has been a very zen panel. We've been tableless, and so in keeping with that, I would like to start something new, and we're going to create our own identicus, which is a haiku that kind of summarizes your experience on this panel about identity. So, and everybody in the audience, if you'd like to participate as well, just remember a haiku is 5 syllables, then 7 syllables, then 5 syllables, and this is a really passive-aggressive way of telling the panel. The first line is 5 syllables, the second line is 7 syllables, the last line is 5 syllables, and you too can tweet your identicus to anybody who would like to lead or just hashtag identicu. I'm pretty sure that URL is probably available. But yeah, if you guys want to take just a couple seconds and think about a haiku, I've already written one. I will go ahead. I will go ahead and tell you what my haiku is for this panel, which is should identity professionals own security? And it goes like this: Barrow Hamilton, Heidi Wachs, Heather Hinton, we're on this panel.
Okay,
That's table stakes. All right, okay. Heather.
So remember, I come from IBM. What is identity? Typewriter to computer. We need security.
I wrote mine down because I can't remember anything. And I should give credit. I outsourced the writing of my haiku because I have 0 creative genes in my body. Privacy, a word. It is way more than passwords. People need to learn that.
Mine is my identity, protect it and secure it as if it were yours.
Nice. and deep. I appreciate that, Daryl.
Thank you.
That's great. So if anybody, we have 52 seconds left. So if anybody has any additional questions they would like to pose to the panel and or would like to recite their own Identicoo out loud for everybody to hear, you're more than welcome to, and we will stick around now for the next 40 seconds.
One quick question. So back to the hot potato, should the identity program report to the CISO, the CIO, the VP of Ops, the business, Chief Risk Officer, where in the organization should the identity program reside?
I'm a CISO, so I want them reporting to me. but that's not biased.
I mean, go ahead.
In today's structure, I would say the CISO as well, because I think it's a piece of that world as it exists today, a critical piece.
I think there's something to be said for risk certainly being part of that conversation, right? As we talk about sort of expanding the definition of what are the crown jewels and how are we approaching it holistically, I think there's something to be said for at least including that in the discussion.
I think the subtext to your question is that we are still very, very siloed. Risk is its own silo, privacy is its own silo, security is its own silo. And I think really fundamentally we need to figure out how to be less siloed, because as long as we stay siloed, we are going to have issues like not doing incidents well.
Any other questions? Or a follow-up if you did not get the exact answer you were looking for. Good.
I think the IR plan also speaks to that as well, because if you develop the IR plan and you're testing the IR plan and you're having tabletops, you're getting to understand who your peers are and how to better collaborate with them.
Yes, yeah.
Well, awesome. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for this installment. We look forward to talking with you throughout the conference. Have a great rest of your day, and don't forget to post your Identicoos.